There's a story every nation tells its people when it goes to war. A story about defending freedom. A story about protecting democracy. A story about stopping evil. And every time, without fail, millions believe it. They believe it because it feels righteous. It feels noble. It feels like something worth sacrificing for. But behind every heroic speech, every waving flag, every patriotic slogan, there is another story. A story most people never learn. A story written not in speeches, but in ledgers. Not in ideals, but in numbers. Not in nationalism, but in profit. Wars are not just fought with soldiers. They're financed, manufactured, insured, shipped, traded, and speculated on. And if you follow the money long enough, you discover something unsettling. The real reasons nations go to war almost never match the reasons they give the public. Because beneath every battlefield lies an economic calculation of a resource to seize, a market to protect, a currency to defend, a debt to enforce, or a geopolitical advantage too profitable to ignore. And once you understand that, once you see the machinery behind the curtain, history starts to look very different. Let's begin with a simple question. If wars are so destructive, so costly, so devastating, why do nations keep starting them? Why do world leaders choose conflict when peace is always cheaper? The answer is simple, and it's existed for thousands of years. Because peace is cheaper for the people. But war is more profitable for the powerful. Every war has two stories. The moral story told to citizens. The financial story understood by governments, banks, and corporations. The first story is emotional. The second story is transactional. The first wins public support. The second explains what actually happens. You were taught the moral stories. World War I began because a duke was assassinated. The United States went to Vietnam to stop communism. Iraq was invaded because of weapons of mass destruction. But behind those narratives lie the real, documented forces, trade routes, resource control, banking interests, corporate lobbying, currency stability. War is not random chaos. It's economic strategy disguised as tragedy. Let's go back to the beginning. Before nations, before borders, before modern governments, ancient empires fought wars for one thing: resources, grain fields, river valleys, trade ports, livestock. Gold. Silver. Timber. Salt. Labor. Every empire from Mesopotamia to Egypt to Rome expanded not for ideology, but for access to wealth, access to trade, access to production. Rome didn't conquer the Mediterranean for freedom. They conquered it for farmland to feed soldiers, silver mines to mint currency, slaves to run plantations, ports to control trade. When Rome defeated Carthage, they didn't just win a rival's territory. They gained control of crucial maritime trade routes and the richest agricultural land in North Africa, land that funded Roman expansion for centuries. Historians describe this pattern plainly. Rome waged war to secure economic survival. The pattern never changed. Only the explanations did. When the 17th century arrived, a new player entered the battlefield: private finance. Nations realized something profound. If you can borrow huge sums, you can wage bigger wars, and whoever can wage the biggest wars controls trade. So countries created national debt systems. England pioneered it in 1694 when war with France drained its gold supply. Merchants offered the government a deal. We will lend you the money. If you give us interest payments backed by taxes. That deal created the Bank of England, government bonds, the modern national debt. It also created something else, a permanent financial incentive to wage war. Because once banks began lending to governments, war became a business model. Every conflict meant more borrowing, more interest, more contracts, more production. Merchants profited. Banks profited. Weapons manufacturers profited. Shipping companies profited. Insurers profited. Investors profited. War wasn't just political anymore. It became industrial. And once war became industrial, it became inevitable. By the 1800s, a new pattern emerged. 1. Nations go to war to secure trade. 2. War creates debt. 3. Debt strengthens banks. 4. Banks fund more wars. 5. Victorious nations seize resources. 6. Those resources fund more warfare. War creates the conditions for more war. Peace, ironically, is the thing that threatens powerful systems built on perpetual debt and spending. This isn't conspiracy. It's basic economic architecture, and it's recorded in central bank charters, bond markets, war budgets, corporate contracts, parliamentary records, and declassified government documents. The evidence is everywhere because the people benefiting never needed to hide it. To them, it wasn't conspiracy, it was strategy. Nowhere is this pattern clearer than in the 2 wars that shaped the modern world. World War I and World War II. Your history teacher said I started because Archduke Franz Ferdinand and was assassinated. That's the moral story. Here's the economic story. Europe was an industrial powder keg. Germany wanted access to Middle Eastern oil fields through the Berlin-Baghdad Railway. Britain saw that as a threat to its naval dominance and petroleum supply. France wanted to weaken German coal and steel power. Austria-Hungary needed control of the Balkans for trade. Russia wanted access to warm water ports. Every side had economic goals. The assassination was simply the spark that lit a fuse built over decades of financial tension. And when war broke out, something extraordinary happened. Profit. Massive profit. Banks lent billions to governments. Factories exploded with weapons production. Shipbuilders, steel manufacturers, chemical companies, and oil giants all entered a golden age. The Rothschild banking network financed multiple allied states. J.P. Morgan became the largest private war financier in history. British munitions manufacturers earned fortunes so large they were investigated by Parliament. Bethlehem Steel, DuPont, and Standard Oil saw record profits. Every month of war meant more money for the suppliers. When the war finally ended, 20 million were dead. But the companies that supplied the war had grown exponentially richer. And that was only the beginning. Your textbooks say World War II was fought to stop tyranny. But the economic engines were unmistakable. Germany invaded Poland for farmland and minerals. Germany invaded the Soviet Union for oil, wheat, and steel. Japan invaded China for coal, iron, and manpower. Japan bombed Pearl Harbor because the U.S. cut off Japanese oil imports. The U.S. entered the war after realizing control of global markets was at stake. The war wasn't just about ideology. It was about who would control the resources that fueled the 20th century. Germany's Operation Edelweiss aimed to seize Caucasus oil fields. Japan's Greater East Asia Co-Prosperity Sphere centered on raw materials extraction. The Allies' bombing campaigns deliberately targeted German chemical and fuel facilities. World War II was a resource war wrapped in moral justification. And after the war ended, the United States made the most significant financial move in history, with Europe destroyed. The U.S. rewrote the rules of global finance. The dollar became the world's reserve currency. Oil was priced in dollars. Global trade flowed through American-controlled institutions. The U.S. military became the guarantor of international markets. This wasn't charity. It was strategy. War gave the United States the world's most powerful currency, the world's largest industrial base, the world's biggest corporate expansion, the world's largest military footprint. By 1950, the U.S. economy was built on 3 pillars: debt, energy, and military protection of trade routes. War had become a business, a predictable, reliable, extremely profitable business. And that pattern continues today. If you look at any major war of the last 70 years through the lens of money instead of morality, the picture becomes clearer. Korea 1950 to 1953 cemented U.S. military power in Asia, protected allies vital to U.S. trade, justified dramatic increases in military production. Vietnam 1955 to 1975 controlled global influence in Southeast Asia, protected shipping routes and mineral access, fueled enormous weapons spending at home. Iraq 2003, the stated reason was weapons of mass destruction. The documented reasons were oil reserves, dollar-denominated oil markets, strategic position between Iran and Saudi Arabia, energy security, reconstruction contracts worth billions, Afghanistan 2001 to 2021, rare earth minerals pipeline corridors for Central Asian gas, military foothold in a region bordering China and Iran, trillions in defense spending flowing back to U.S. contractors. Official reasons are emotional. Real reasons are economic. If citizens understood the financial machinery behind war, support for wars would collapse. But if governments keep the moral story on the surface and the economic story beneath it, wars become easier to justify. That's the game. That's the pattern. And it's been consistent for centuries. Every war begins with a simple question: who stands to gain and who cannot afford to lose? Governments talk about honor, morality, and national duty, but behind every speech is a ledger, a balance sheet, and a list of industries waiting to profit. War is never only about soldiers or slogans. It's about supply chains, contracts, and control of markets. If you follow the flow of money instead of the flow of flags, you find the blueprint that explains almost every modern conflict. The military-industrial complex didn't appear out of nowhere. It was engineered, piece by piece, by people who realized war was the most reliable revenue stream on Earth. Armies need weapons, uniforms, fuel, food, bullets, aircraft, ships, vehicles, and billions of dollars to sustain even a short conflict. And all of that spending flows into private hands. War shifts money from taxpayers to corporations faster than any bill or law ever could. Whether a war is won or lost, someone always gets paid. World War II is remembered as a fight between good and evil, but economically, it was the largest industrial stimulus in human history. U.S. factories that sat idle during the Depression suddenly run 24 hours a day producing tanks, jeeps, aircraft, bombs, radios, boots, and uniforms. Companies like Boeing, Lockheed, General Motors, and Ford transformed from manufacturers into wartime giants whose profits reached levels the civilian market could never match. The war ended, but the industrial system created to feed it never stopped growing. The Cold War ensured that the machinery of war kept running, even without actual battles between superpowers. Instead of troops charging across trenches, nations fought proxy wars fueled by weapons contracts, intelligence budgets, and global resource strategies. Every confrontation in Korea, Vietnam, Afghanistan, and the Middle East became an opportunity for governments to justify more spending and for corporations to secure long-term contracts. A permanent war economy had been created, and once it existed, it became impossible to dismantle. The key players in the modern war economy are not generals or presidents. They are defense contractors, energy companies, banks, intelligence agencies, and industries that thrive under instability. A missile manufacturer earns nothing during peace, but millions during conflict. Oil companies profit when regions destabilize and energy prices surge. Banks loan money to governments for military spending, collecting interest for decades. War is not chaos. It's extremely organized profit extraction. Every time a country goes to war, the same pattern repeats. The public is told there is a moral duty at stake, a threat to freedom, a tyrant who must be stopped, or a humanitarian crisis that demands intervention. But behind the speeches are committees, lobbyists, shareholders, and trade networks pointing at maps and calculating returns. Wars are framed as last resorts, but the financial architecture around them is built years in advance. When the moment arrives, the decision feels inevitable because the economic incentives are already locked into place. Industries connected to war do not simply react to conflict, they shape the environment. That makes conflict more likely. When hundreds of billions depend on military budgets, the system naturally gravitates toward tension, fear, and escalation. Defense contractors lobby governments to increase spending. Produce reports warning of foreign threats, and finance think tanks that promote aggressive policies. The public sees these warnings as objective analysis, but they often originate from organizations funded by the very industries that profit from war. The intelligence community also plays a central economic role, not because it profits directly from weapons, but because it controls information. When intelligence agencies say a country is a threat, budgets increase across the entire government. Surveillance technology firms get contracts. Cybersecurity companies explode in value. Defense consulting firms write new protocols and training manuals. Fear becomes a commodity, and the agencies that produce it become indispensable. Oil and resource companies are another pillar of modern warfare. Many conflicts over the past century can be traced back to control of energy reserves, minerals, trade routes, or supply infrastructure. Nations don't always fight over territory, they fight over what lies under that territory. Whether it's Middle Eastern oil, African cobalt, South American lithium, or Central Asian pipelines, wars are often disguised resource grabs built on legal language and patriotic storytelling. The narrative is freedom. The reality is extraction. Every major conflict also involves financial institutions that loan money to governments to fund military operations. These loans generate interest for decades, binding entire populations to debts created during wars they never supported. Banks and sovereign lenders play both sides, financing weapons for one nation while providing reconstruction loans to another. War destroys cities, but financial institutions profit from both the destruction and the rebuilding. In this system, peace is the only outcome with no guaranteed return. Governments justify war spending by framing it as necessary for national security. But the scale of modern military budgets far exceeds defensive needs. The world spends trillions annually on armed forces, technology, and intelligence infrastructure. This money could erase poverty, fix crumbling infrastructure, fund education, or advance scientific research. But war spending is politically safer because it benefits influential industries that donate to campaigns, fund lobbying, and shape public messaging. Peace may be morally right, but war is financially convenient. Countries often claim wars promote democracy or protect human rights, but the outcomes rarely match the rhetoric. Nations intervene selectively, ignoring atrocities in regions with no economic value, while focusing intensely on regions rich in resources or strategic position. Humanitarian language is used only when it aligns with financial interests. It becomes a moral excuse wrapped around an economic objective, giving the public a story it can accept while the machinery of war moves in the background. Modern conflicts are increasingly fought through sanctions, currency manipulation, and economic pressure instead of traditional combat. These forms of war are quieter but financially devastating. Sanctions can collapse industries, cripple economies, and create humanitarian crises without a single shot fired. Currency wars can drain national reserves, destabilize regions, and force governments into geopolitical submission. These tools are marketed as peaceful alternatives to conflict, but they are simply economic weapons by another name. When nations escalate tensions, the decision is rarely spontaneous. It is the result of decades of strategic planning built around resource dependency, economic competition, and global influence. Governments present these confrontations as ideological battles, but behind closed doors. They revolve around trade routes, currency dominance, and control over emerging markets. Nations do not go to war because they hate each other. They go to war because they want to protect economic advantages or secure new ones. War is predictable because it follows the same blueprint across centuries. A nation identifies a resource, region, or strategic advantage it wants to control. Its industries begin positioning themselves to benefit from future conflict. Politicians amplify threats, media narratives intensify, and public opinion shifts. When the moment comes, the decision is sold as urgent and unavoidable. But the economic plan was crafted long before the first shot was fired. Most citizens never see this blueprint because their understanding of war comes from emotional narratives, not financial analysis. Schools teach wars as battles of good versus evil, democracy versus tyranny, or heroes versus villains. They rarely discuss the mineral wealth of contested regions, the trade routes involved, or the economic interests of companies operating behind the scenes. By removing economics from the explanation, the public is kept in the dark about the real motives that drive global conflict. To understand modern warfare, you must view countries like corporations competing for market share. Nations fight for resources, labor, influence, and access to emerging markets. Allies are business partners, enemies are competitors, and civilians are stakeholders who bear the cost when the corporate state goes to war. In this model, war is not a failure of diplomacy, it is a continuation of economic strategy by violent means. The battlefield is simply the final stage of negotiations. The irony is that nations often justify wars by claiming they cannot afford not to fight. They argue that losing strategic ground would cost more in the long run than the war itself. But this logic is circular, because the industries that profit from war help shape the conditions that make war seem unavoidable. Governments insist that military spending protects economic interests, but much of that spending flows into private hands rather than public benefit. War becomes the answer to problems created by the same system that demands war. This is why wars repeat across history, not because humanity is violent by nature, but because the economic incentives never change. As long as profits flow upward during conflict, and as long as industries depend on military spending to survive, wars will continue. Peace threatens too many powerful interests. Stability removes too many opportunities for profit. The world is not addicted to war out of ideology, it is addicted to the money war produces.